They laughed when I asked to hold the baby. It wasn't a gentle chuckle, the kind that softens the edges of a polite refusal. It was a sharp, involuntary bark, a sound that sliced through the polite hum of the gathering, making the air in the room thick and cold. My son, Michael, looked away quickly, pretending he hadn't heard it, adjusting the blanket around the infant bundle cradled in his arms. Sarah, his wife, didn't even bother to hide her amusement, her lips pulled back over teeth that were too perfect, her eyes crinkling at the corners in genuine unfiltered ridicule. The baby, Charlotte, their Charlotte, slept on, oblivious to the small, quiet violence being enacted in her presence. I was standing just steps from them, in their living room in Naperville, Illinois, the late afternoon sun casting long, indifferent shadows across the expensive rug I had helped them pick out. I had driven 2 hours to be there, past cornfields turning brown, past the endless identical houses of the suburbs that had swallowed up the prairie. And this was the welcome, a laugh, a dismissal disguised as humor. I felt the heat rise in my face, a slow, agonizing flush that I desperately tried to suppress. I focused on the framed pictures on the mantelpiece, pictures of them, pictures of the baby, none of me. I focused on the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, on anything but the two faces that had just delivered a calculated blow. If any part of this feels familiar to you, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. The sound echoed in the sudden silence that followed. People nearby shifted uncomfortably, glancing quickly between us, then looking away. Sarah's sister, standing by the window, suddenly became very interested in the weather outside. Michael's college friend cleared his throat loudly. The laughter had hung in the air, sharp and brittle, a clear declaration of where I stood in their world, on the periphery, asking permission for the most basic natural interaction with my own grandchild. My hands, which I had half raised in anticipation, felt clumsy and useless, hanging by my sides. I lowered them slowly, clasping them together, my knuckles pressing white against each other. I looked at Charlotte again, her tiny face peaceful, a miniature version of Michael's jawline. I had held Michael hours after he was born, his skin still red and wrinkled, his tiny fingers curling around mine with surprising strength. I had held him through colic, through teething, through scraped knees, and first report cards. Now, holding his daughter felt like a privilege I had to earn, a favor to be granted, or apparently denied with mockery. The humiliation was a physical weight, settling onto my shoulders, making my back stiffen. It wasn't just about holding the baby, it was about everything. Years of subtle slights, of being invented rather than consulted, of my experience being dismissed as old-fashioned or irrelevant. It was about the slow, steady erosion of my place in their lives, culminating in this moment of open contempt. Sarah had turned her back now, talking to someone about the baby's feeding schedule. Her voice bright and confident. Michael was showing someone a picture on his phone, a picture of Charlotte. Naturally, they acted as if I had vanished, as if my request, and their cruel response, had never happened. But the sound of that laugh was seared into my memory, a hot brand on my already tender skin. I looked around the room at the smiling faces, at the baby nestled in her father's arms, and felt an utter desolate loneliness. I had come hoping for connection, for the simple joy of being a grandmother, and instead found myself an unwelcome guest, invisible except when I dared to inconvenience them with my presence. They had decided early on that my help wasn't needed. When Charlotte was due, I had offered to come stay for a few weeks, help with meals, night feedings, whatever they needed. Michael had hesitated, then said, "That's sweet, Mom, but we've got it covered. Sarah's mom is coming, and we're hiring a night nurse." Sarah's mom lived an hour away. I lived 2 hours away. The message was clear. I was not the preferred support system. Sarah's mom had stayed for a month. I had been invited for a weekend visit after the night nurse left. That visit had been polite, strange. I had felt like I was walking on eggshells, afraid to offer advice, afraid to touch anything. Acutely aware of Sarah's watchful eyes, she had a way of making me feel like a clumsy intruder. Even in their meticulously organized, beige-toned house, everything had its place. My suggestions, my past experiences, apparently did not. I remembered offering to wash a load of the baby's laundry, seeing a small pile in the hamper. Sarah had swooped in instantly, saying, "Oh, no, thank you. I have a specific way I do her clothes. Special detergent, Air dry only. It's fine, I'll get to it. It was a small thing, but it felt like another door closing. Another area where my help, my knowledge was not just unwanted, but potentially damaging. I had raised two children successfully, navigating sleepless nights and laundry mountains without specific detergents and air drying. But that counted for nothing here. My history was irrelevant. Their way was the only way. This pattern had been established subtly over the years, starting perhaps when Michael first brought Sarah home, her bright, ambitious energy a stark contrast to my quieter nature. She was a project manager, organized and direct. I was a retired teacher, used to patience and finding value in small moments. Our differences, instead of being pentarum, became points of friction, manufactured by her need for control. The house itself felt like a fortress against me. It was new construction, all sharp lines and muted colors. The nursery was at the end of a short hallway. Its door usually closed. I had peeked in once when Sarah was distracted. It was perfect, like a page from a magazine. Soft gray walls, expensive wooden crib, piles of pristine white onesies. Everything was controlled, curated, and access was controlled too. Visitors were allowed in on a schedule. Holding the baby was by invitation. Everything about it felt designed to keep the messiness, the unpredictability, the shared history of family at bay. My history, specifically. I had given them gifts, of course. A hand-knitted blanket, heirloom silver rattles, contributions to the college fund, all accepted with polite thanks, then tucked away or acknowledged briefly before the conversation moved on. The knitted blanket had vanished after the first visit. I never saw it again. I didn't ask. I was learning to not ask questions, to not offer, to simply exist quietly in the space they allowed me, which was shrinking. I looked at the nursery door now, closed, solid. Behind it lay my grandchild, and the room that symbolized everything I was being excluded from. The physical barrier felt like a deliberate extension of the emotional one they had built. A wall with a lock on it. The idea of a key, of gaining entry, began to form not just as a desire to hold the baby, but as a need to breach that wall, to reclaim some small piece of the family space that was rightfully mine. Not to take over, not to interfere, but simply to exist within it, recognized and valued. The closed door felt like a challenge. It wasn't just the baby. It was the accumulation of years. The way Sarah would interrupt me mid-sentence, her voice overriding mine as if what I was saying was unimportant noise. The way Michael would let her, his eyes avoiding mine. The dinner where Sarah had regaled guests with a story about my supposedly terrible cooking skills when Michael was a child, a story that was exaggerated to the point of cruelty. While I sat there, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, the food suddenly tasteless. Michael had chuckled along. It wasn't just Sarah, it was Michael's passive complicity that hurt the most. The son I had raised, taught values, sacrificed for, stood by, while his wife belittled me, secluded me. He had become a stranger, molded into someone who prioritized his wife's comfort and control above his own mother's feelings. The laughter today was just the loudest expression of a long-standing attitude. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. It was meant to put me in my place, to remind me that I was an outsider. I stood by the edge of the room, the chatter swirling around me. I felt a quiet shift happening inside me. The familiar ache of hurt and humiliation began to mingle with something colder, something harder. A resolve was forming, slow and steady, like concrete setting. I had spent years trying to be the good mother-in-law, the quiet grandmother, the accommodating guest. I had tried to earn their affection, their respect, by making myself small, by not making waves. It hadn't worked. It had only emboldened them. They saw my compliance as weakness, my quietness as tacit agreement to my own erasure. But there was a strength in me, forged over decades of navigating life's challenges, raising a family, building a career. It had been dormant, buried under layers of disappointment and self-doubt. Now it stirred. I looked at the closed nursery door again. The key wasn't just for holding the baby. It was for opening a door that had been deliberately shut on me. It was time to stop asking permission. It was time to take back my place. The thought wasn't angry. It was calm, a quiet decision made in the midst of their oblivious party. The party wound down eventually. Guests made their polite goodbyes. Sarah and Michael stood by the door, accepting compliments on the baby, on their home, on the lovely afternoon. I stayed in the living room, watching from a distance. I saw the casual intimacy between them, the way Sarah leaned into Michael, the way he put his arm around her waist. It was a picture of a unit, complete and self-contained, with no room for outside elements, especially not for me. When the last guest left, the house felt suddenly hollow. The forced gaiety gone. Michael carried the sleeping baby towards the nursery. Sarah started clearing plates, her movements efficient and precise. I stood up, feeling stiff. I should be going, I said. Michael turned. Oh, okay, Mom. Drive safe. No offer to help me with my bag. No invitation to stay for a quiet dinner. Just a polite dismissal. Sarah didn't even look up from scraping food into the trash. I walked down the short hallway towards the front door. As I passed the nursery, the door was slightly ajar. Michael was placing Charlotte in the crib. I paused in the hallway, looking. He didn't see me. Sarah called from the kitchen. Did you latch the door? Michael replied. Yeah. I saw him push the door shut, the latch clicking softly into place. He reappeared in the hallway, saw me standing there. Ready, Mom? He asked, his tone neutral. My eyes went from the closed door back to him. In that moment, I didn't see the baby. I saw the barrier. I saw the years of being kept out. And I saw the quiet resolve harden into concrete action. I needed the key. Not just a key to the nursery, but the key to their control, to my own freedom from their casual cruelty. The legal plan, the gathering of proof, the reestablishment of boundaries, it all coalesced into a single purpose. I needed to reclaim my space, my identity, my right to be a grandmother on my own terms, not theirs. And the path to that started with challenging their absolute authority. The nursery door wasn't just a door, it was the symbol of their power, locked against me. I would find a way to open it. I drove back home in the fading light, the image of the closed nursery door replaying in my mind. The silence of my own house felt different that night. Not lonely, but quiet, with a simmering intensity. I knew I couldn't let this continue. The casual dismissal, the outright ridicule, it was eroding me, piece by piece. I thought about the conversation with Michael, the one where he'd told me about Sarah's mother staying. He had been avoiding my gaze then, too, a habit he picked up when he was a teenager and didn't want to deal with a difficult topic. It was a sign of his discomfort, but also of his capitulation. He wasn't standing up to Sarah. He was siding with her, even if it meant hurting me. This wasn't just a conflict between mother and daughter-in-law. It was a fundamental breakdown of the relationship with my son. And that breakdown was allowing Sarah to dictate the terms of my grandmotherhood. I needed advice, someone who understood complex family dynamics and legal rights, but also someone grounded in reality, not just abstract legal theory. I thought of Susan. Susan had been my friend since college. She was a family law attorney, sharp and compassionate. Having navigated her own challenging divorce years ago, she understood how messy life could get, how seemingly small slights could build into insurmountable walls. I hadn't talked to her in a while, but her face came to mind. Her steady gaze, her no-nonsense attitude. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her name. I hesitated for a moment, staring at it. Making this call felt like crossing a threshold, acknowledging that things were bad enough to seek professional help. But the image of Sarah's laughing face, the click of the nursery door latch, propelled me forward. I needed a plan, a strategy, something more effective than quiet suffering. I pressed call. Susan answered on the third ring, her voice clear and calm. Eleanor? It's been too long. How are you? The simple question, spoken with genuine warmth, was almost enough to break me. I took a breath, steadying myself. Susan, I said, my voice feeling rough, I need to talk to you. It's about Michael and Sarah, and the baby. The silence on the other end was brief, attentive. Okay, Eleanor, Susan said gently. Tell me everything. Talking to Susan was like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. I laid it all out, the subtle exclusions, the critical comments disguised as jokes, the way Michael stood by, the culmination in the nursery incident. I explained the feeling of being a pariah, of being denied access to my grandchild and my son's life. Susan listened patiently, asking clarifying questions, her legal mind already sifting through the emotional narrative for the pertinent details. She explained that while grandparents' rights laws varied by state and were often challenging, particularly when the parents were married and together, there were avenues to explore. The key was proving an existing meaningful relationship with the child and demonstrating that denial of access was harmful to the child's well-being, or that the parents were unfit, which was not the case here. Michael and Sarah were perfectly competent parents, just cruel. More immediately, she focused on establishing a pattern of behavior, documenting the instances of exclusion and control. She advised me to start keeping a journal, noting dates, times, and specifics of interactions, or lack thereof. Every canceled visit, every dismissive comment, every time I was kept from holding Charlotte. She also suggested attempting mediated communication, perhaps through a family therapist, to open lines of dialogue, though she acknowledged Sarah's likely resistance. The legal route, she said, should be a last resort, costly and emotionally draining for everyone. But the threat of legal action, based on solid documentation, could sometimes compel parents to negotiate. It's about establishing boundaries, Eleanor, she said. They've been pushing you out, and you've allowed them to. You need to show them, calmly and firmly, that you have rights too, and a legitimate place in Charlotte's life. The conversation lasted over an hour. When I hung up, I felt exhausted but also a flicker of hope. I wasn't powerless. I had options. The quiet decision made in their hallway felt validated. Taking the nursery key wasn't just an emotional impulse. It was the starting point of a strategic reclamation. I went to my desk drawer and pulled out a new notebook. I wrote the date at the top of the first page, and I began to write down everything I could remember. The laughter, the closed door, the years of being made to feel small. The documentation had begun. Over the next few weeks, keeping the journal became a quiet ritual. I noted the phone calls that went unanswered, the invitations that never came, the brief, controlled fast-time calls where Charlotte was shown but never close enough for me to interact meaningfully. I documented the one brief visit I had managed to arrange, coffee at a neutral cafe, where Sarah had kept Charlotte in her carrier the entire time, citing it was nap time, despite the baby being wide awake. I wrote about the conversations that circled the drain, where I tried to express my feelings and was met with polite deflection or icy silence. It was painful to relive these moments, to see the pattern laid bare in stark, written detail, but it was also empowering. The nebulous feeling of being hurt and excluded became concrete evidence. Each entry was a small act of resistance, a refusal to let their actions fade into the background noise of my life. Susan had also suggested exploring non-legal avenues first, to demonstrate good faith. I sent Sarah an email, carefully worded, suggesting we talk about establishing a regular schedule for visits, perhaps one afternoon a week, just me and Charlotte. I focused on the benefits for Charlotte, the importance of a relationship with her grandmother. The reply came 2 days later, brief and cool. We're very busy right now, Eleanor, with Charlotte's schedule and our work. Maybe in a few months. We'll let you know. It was another dismissal, polite but firm. I forwarded the email to Susan. More documentation, she replied simply. The "will let you know" was a classic tactic, she said, a way to maintain control and avoid commitment. They had no intention of letting me know. My hopes for a simple resolution through communication dwindled, replaced by a grim determination. I continued journaling. I noted Michael's increasing silence on the phone, his hurried goodbyes. He was withdrawing, caught between his wife and his mother, and choosing to appease the person physically present in his life. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about Michael too, and his failure to act as a bridge or even acknowledge my pain. The quiet tension stretched, a silent war waged through unanswered texts and carefully constructed excuses. The silence from Michael and Sarah grew heavier. After the email exchange, communication became almost non-existent. My calls went unanswered more often than not. Texts received only perfunctory, delayed reply. I stopped initiating contact as frequently, following Susan's advice to create a measured distance, forcing them to feel the void, if they even noticed it. I focused on the documentation, filling the notebook with observations. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that they had taken Charlotte to visit Sarah's relatives out of state, a week-long trip I hadn't been told about until after they returned. Another instance of deliberate exclusion, the nursery key felt more symbolic now. It wasn't just about physical access to the room. It was about access to their lives, to the simple, everyday moments of being a family. And that access was being systematically denied. Susan advised me to send a formal letter via certified mail, outlining my concerns and proposing a specific visitation schedule. This letter, drafted with Susan's guidance, was calm, factual, and expressed my love for Charlotte and my desire to be a positive presence in her life. It also, subtly, referenced my rights and intentions to pursue all available avenues if necessary. Sending that letter felt like another significant step, raising the stakes. It was no longer just a personal plea. It was a formal communication, the kind that could be used in court. The waiting period for their response was agonizing. Every time the mail truck went by, my heart would race. When the certified mail receipt finally came back, signed by Sarah, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. They had received it. The ball was in their court. Susan predicted they would likely ignore it or respond defensively. She was right. A few days later, a short, sharp email arrived from Sarah. It accused me of being demanding and unreasonable. It reiterated that they would decide who saw Charlotte and when. It made no mention of a schedule, only of their right to parent as they saw fit, free from outside pressure. It was dismissive and final, closing the door even more firmly. But it was also a reaction, a sign that my actions were having an effect, forcing them out of their comfortable silence. This email, too, went into the file Susan was building. The legal process was now a distinct possibility. With the formal letter dismissed and communication shut down, the path forward became clearer, albeit more difficult. Susan confirmed that we had established a pattern of denial and my good faith attempts at resolution. The next step, if I chose to pursue it, would be filing a petition for grandparent visitation rights with the court. Susan walked me through the process, the legal arguments, the potential outcomes, the emotional toll of litigation. It would be public, adversarial, and could potentially damage any remaining shred of a relationship with Michael and Sarah. But not pursuing it meant accepting my current status, a marginal figure, allowed glimpses of my grandchild only at their capricious discretion. It meant accepting their power over me, their ability to define my role, or lack thereof, in Charlotte's life. I thought about the quiet moments I yearned for, reading a book to Charlotte, watching her sleep, teaching her something small and simple, moments that grandparents are meant to share. These moments were being stolen from me. The nursery key, the symbol of access and control, felt more vital than ever. It wasn't just about the literal key to the room, but the metaphorical key to breaking their stranglehold on my grandmotherhood. I reread entries in my journal, the quiet accumulation of hurt, the casual cruelties. I look at pictures of Charlotte I had saved on my phone, seeing her grow and change from a distance. The pain was a dull, constant ache, but beneath the ache was the hard, unyielding core of resolve that had formed that day in Naperville. I deserved a place in Charlotte's life. She deserved to know her grandmother. I called Susan. "Let's proceed," I said. My voice was steady. "Let's file." Susan was quiet for a moment. "Okay, Eleanor. I understand. It's a tough road, but we'll do everything we can. The goal isn't necessarily to force visitation through court, but to use the legal framework to compel them to negotiate seriously." It was a gamble, a high-stakes maneuver that could end in complete alienation. But staying put, accepting their terms, felt like a slow, agonizing death of a relationship I cherished, a relationship I hadn't even been fully allowed to begin. The decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. I was fighting, not just for access to Charlotte, but for my own dignity, my right to exist fully as her grandmother. The quiet fight was about to become very loud, at least in the eyes of the law. Filing the petition sent ripples through their carefully constructed world. Michael called, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. "Mom, what are you doing? We got something from a lawyer. This is insane." He didn't ask why, didn't express any understanding of my feelings. His only reaction was shock and outrage that I had dared to challenge them. "I tried talking to you, Michael," I said calmly. "I tried reaching out, sending emails asking for a simple schedule. You and Sarah shut me out. You wouldn't let me see Charlotte." "That's not true," he protested weakly. We're busy. We'll invite you over soon." It was the same old deflection. "Soon isn't good enough anymore, Michael," I said. "You've left me no choice. I want to be a part of her life, a real part, not just a guest who is tolerated occasionally." He sputtered, unable to form a coherent argument against my quiet resolve. Sarah got on the phone. her voice sharper, colder than Michael's. "You are unbelievable, Eleanor. Trying to sue us? Over our daughter? This is harassment. You're just trying to cause trouble." "I'm trying to be her grandmother, Sarah," I replied, my voice low but firm. "Something you have made increasingly difficult, impossible, even." The conversation devolved quickly into accusations and recriminations. They painted me as an aggressor, an unstable force trying to disrupt their happy family. They conveniently ignored their own actions that had led to this point. It was clear they had no intention of understanding, only of defending their perceived territory. Susan had warned me this might happen, that they would react defensively, perhaps viciously. But hearing it, feeling the full force of their combined anger directed at me, was still painful. It reinforced, however, that my action was necessary. Their reaction wasn't one of hurt or regret, but of indignant fury at having their control challenged. They saw my pursuit of grandparent rights not as a cry for connection, but as an invasion. The court process began, a series of filings and responses, depositions and mediation attempts. It was sterile and formal, a stark contrast to the messy, emotional reality of family estrangement. But within that formal structure, my story was finally being heard, documented, and presented with the weight of legal precedent behind it. It wasn't the way I ever wanted to interact with my son and his family, but it was the only way left to open the door they had locked. The nursery key was no longer just a passive object. It was the access code I was fighting for. The mediation session was mandated by the court before a trial could be scheduled. We met in a neutral office, a small conference room with a round table, designed to feel less adversarial than a courtroom. Susan was with me. Michael and Sarah sat opposite us, their faces set and defensive. The mediator was a calm, experienced woman who explained the process, an attempt to find common ground, to reach an agreement outside of litigation. We each took turns presenting our perspective, though it felt less like sharing and more like stating opposing cases. Sarah spoke first, articulate and composed. She presented a narrative of a busy young family trying to navigate parenthood, being harassed by a demanding and interfering mother-in-law. She listed instances where she felt I had been critical or overbearing, distortions of past events. Of course, she emphasized their right as parents to make all decisions regarding their child, free from external pressure. Michael added little, nodding along with Sarah's points, occasionally interjecting brief agreements. When it was my turn, I spoke quietly, calmly, focusing on my love for Charlotte and my desire for a consistent, loving relationship with her. I referenced specific dates and events from my journal, the unanswered calls, the canceled visits, the incident at the party, the email. I explained the pain of being excluded, of seeing my role as a grandmother systematically diminished. I didn't accuse or blame. I simply stated the facts of my experience and the depth of my emotional need to be present in Charlotte's life. Susan added the legal context, explaining the basis for grandparent visitation rights and the court's consideration of the child's best interest. As I spoke, I watched Michael. He avoided my eyes for most of the session, but occasionally his gaze would flicker towards me, a brief moment of something unreadable, shame, discomfort. It was hard to tell. Sarah remained impassive, occasionally jotting notes. The mediator guided the conversation towards potential solutions, a fixed visitation schedule, communication protocols, holiday arrangements. Sarah and Michael were resistant to any formal schedule, insisting on maintaining control. I held firm, stating that sporadic, unpredictable access was what had led us here. The session was long and emotionally draining. We didn't reach a full agreement, but we did make small progress. They grudgingly agreed to consider a set bi-weekly visit, though the terms remained contentious. More importantly, I had forced them to sit and listen, to hear my perspective not as emotional pleading, but as a documented history of exclusion. The nursery key wasn't in my hand yet, but the negotiation for its access had begun in earnest. The partial progress made in mediation was fragile. We left the session with an agreement to draft a potential visitation schedule based on the discussion points, but without a firm commitment from Michael and Sarah. Susan worked with their lawyer on a proposed document. The back and forth was slow. Each clause debated. They pushed for limited time, supervised visits, the ability to cancel with little notice. I pushed for consistency, unsupervised time, clear communication protocols, It felt less like creating a family plan and more like negotiating a treaty between warring states. Meanwhile, contact remained minimal. I received carefully curated photos of Charlotte via text message, often sent by Sarah with a brief, impersonal caption. It was a way of showing me she existed, but without allowing any real interaction. I resisted the urge to respond with anything more than a simple thank you. I continued my own life, reconnecting with friends, focusing on my hobbies, finding strength in my independence. I knew that part of reclaiming my space meant not making my life solely about this conflict or solely dependent on their unpredictable willingness to include me. I found a quiet strength in my own home, in my own routines. The nursery key, in my mind, began to represent not just access to Charlotte, but access to a family dynamic where I was respected, where my presence wasn't conditional. That kind of access had to be demanded, not requested. The legal pressure remained, a silent force pushing towards resolution. Susan kept me informed, calm and steady. She reminded me that forcing the issue through court was a lengthy process, and that even a court-ordered schedule could be emotionally fraught. The goal was always to reach a point where a voluntary agreement felt like the better option for them, compared to continued legal battle. It required patience, endurance, and the unwavering certainty that my desire for a relationship with Charlotte was valid and worth fighting for. This period was a test of that endurance, a waiting game played out in legal documents and calculated silences. The turning point came not with a dramatic courtroom victory, but with a quiet capitulation. The pressure of the ongoing legal process, the cost, the drain on their energy, and perhaps a subtle shift in Michael's perspective, began to wear them down. Susan's steady representation, backed by the detailed documentation I had provided, showed them that I was serious and prepared to see it through. Their lawyer initiated a new round of negotiations, this time with a noticeably different tone. They were ready to settle. The final agreement wasn't everything I had initially hoped for, but it was a significant step forward. It included a set schedule for visits, alternating weekends for a few hours, and clear guidelines for communication. It acknowledged my right to spend time with Charlotte consistently and privately. There were compromises on both sides, but the Fendenim win was the establishment of a formal, enforceable structure for my relationship with my grandchild, independent of Sarah's whim or Michael's passive allowance. It wasn't about taking a literal key to a physical nursery door. It was about unlocking the door to a consistent presence in Charlotte's life, guaranteed by something outside of their control. The process of reaching this agreement felt less like a victory celebration and more like the weary end of a long campaign. There were no hugs, no apologies. The final document was signed in separate rooms, exchanged between lawyers. It was a cold, formal conclusion to a deeply emotional conflict, but it represented a reclaiming of my time, my rights, my place. The quiet strength I had cultivated over the past months was not about forcing affection, but about forcing respect. They might not welcome me with open arms, but they could no longer simply shut me out. The agreement was the new nursery key, a legal document granting me access to a part of the family life I had been denied. It wasn't the warm, natural access I had envisioned, but it was real, and it was mine. Life after the agreement settled into a new rhythm. My visits with Charlotte began. They were structured, predictable, often starting with a brief, strained handover at their doorstep or a nearby park. Sarah was polite but distant. Michael still awkward and often silent. But then there was Charlotte. Spending time with her, just the two of us, was everything I had fought for. I read to her from board books, watched her explore the playground with wide-eyed wonder, held her hand as she took shaky steps. These moments were simple, profound. She was a bright, curious child, innocent of the conflict that had swirled around her. My interactions with Michael and Sarah remained formal. We communicated primarily through text or email, coordinating schedules and logistics. The deep, easy connection I had once shared with my son seemed irrevocably altered, scarred by the battle. There was a sadness in that, a permanent ache for what had been lost. But there was also a quiet satisfaction in having stood my ground, in having refused to be erased. The house in Naperville, with its closed nursery door, no longer held the same power over me. I had found my own way back to Charlotte, not through their permission, but through my own persistence. The key I had taken, or rather fought for, was the key to my own agency. I had reclaimed my dignity, my right to be her grandmother, not just in title, but in presence. My own home felt different now, not quiet with loneliness, but peaceful with hard-won independence. The silence was my own, filled with the echoes of Charlotte's laughter during our visits, and the quiet certainty that I had done what was necessary. It wasn't the easy path, but it was the path that led me back to myself and to my grandchild on terms I could live with. The fight was over. A fragile, new beginning had dawned.